Okay, welcome everyone to another installment on our blog. I'm here. I'm Tony Forrest, and I'm here with my best friend Ken Steponaitis.
Yeah, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How about yourself, Ken?
I'm hanging in there.
We have a very interesting topic today, and it deals with women in the church. Ken, let's get started with our topic today, and it is really women in the church, and ultimately the question of should women, will women, a woman ever become a deacon or a priest? And I think we need to look at some, historical, precedents. And
Sure.
why don't we start with Vatican II? Because before Vatican II, there was very little involvement on the laity, in terms of the church and all of that. And I remember my parents telling me, when they were younger, that they basically, they went to mass, but there was nothing for them to do outside of attending mass. So can you tell us a little bit of some of the changes that happened during Vatican II?
Sure. But let me step back just a bit. What's ironic about that is in the early church, women were very involved, and we'll get into that later. But so it's kind of taken several turns. In the Middle Ages, in fact, probably even before the Middle Ages, women involvement in liturgy at all was next to nil. And as you know, before Vatican II, the only time women actually did anything with regard to the church was to clean the church, or they might have had some nuns cleaning up the altar or something like that, and there was no involvement in the actual mass itself with women. After Vatican II, it was pretty clear that Vatican II wanted to get all laity involved in the mass and in various. Nowadays, of course, we have women lectors, we have girl altar servers, not just altar boys.
Right.
We have Eucharistic ministers, and they can be men or women that are doing those types of roles.
Yeah, and it's the involvement in general of the laity that came, through with Vatican II.
That's
That
right.
really, really has opened up the door for a lot of ministries, like this one that we're having now, in terms of being able to reach people out, with blogs and discussions.
Priests did everything. They were the principals of schools,
Yeah.
and they took control of the parishes completely. There really wasn't women involvement in the parish at all, except you might have some nuns that were teaching in the schools, things like that. But women had next to no influence in the church at all prior to Vatican II.
And boy, do I remember the nuns teaching at school.
Yeah, I've heard about them.
Yes, I'm definitely a product of the nuns. They were very strict. You think that you could run over a nun? Oh my gosh, no. They, they were very strict. They were excellent. I really have good memories of my Catholic education.
Well, I'm glad you do, because I know there's some people that talk about the rulers across the knuckles and those kinds of things. But
yeah, I don't think I ever got hit, but I was warned a couple of times. So
yeah, sure.
No, but today we see women involved in a lot of things that people may not be aware of. Women are involved as, running the finances for parishes.
Exactly.
They are involved as spiritual directors. Almost every position that it's open to the laity, today has women involved in, or at the very, or even, being in charge of those particular areas.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing the amount of change that has occurred with regard to that. And so even at St. Joseph, where my parish is, I don't think there's a single ministry in the church where the directors are not female. We have a woman who is in charge of the facilities. We have a woman who's in charge of the finances. We have a woman in charge of faith formation. We have a woman in charge of the school. We have a woman in charge of choir. We have a woman in charge of youth ministry. So virtually everything in that parish is run by women.
So that really helps clarify that misnomer that women are not holding, a lot of positions of authority in the church itself. And even
Right.
I was looking at some statistics that over the past 10 years, I think it's called the Roman Curia, which is the organization under the Pope itself,
Right.
and not necessarily like Pope cardinals and all that, but the functioning body of the Catholic Church itself. The involvement of women has grown, and even though it seems insignificant, for example, under Pope Benedict, I think it was 17% of the people in charge were women. Under Pope Francis, it has gone up to 22%. So the church is evolving and including women more and more. And people will say, "Oh, 22%, that's not enough." But considering how male-driven the church has been throughout the years, I think we see a lot of positive change.
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's so interesting because in the first centuries of the church, first 2 centuries of the church especially, women were directly involved in the running of the church. And so we went from that and then back to it. It's pretty amazing. Pope Francis is probably one of the more progressive popes we've had, if not the most progressive pope we've had in a long time. And he's been very clear about bringing women into critical roles in the church, and that women need to have a voice in the church because they offer up something that just men can't do. And so he's been very clear about that, and he's been open about things like the possibility of ordination of deacons, women deacons. So we'll see.
That is awesome. You talked about Acts of the Apostle. Why don't we jump right into that and start talking a little bit of that, because that is the first instance that we see of deacons being the position of deacon being created, if you will. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So Saint Stephen, along with 7 other men, if you read, I think it's in chapter 6. I have to go back and make sure, but good.
I knew you were going to be prepared, so I said I better figure it out. Yeah. So yes.
Okay, so in chapter, good. And so the church was growing so fast during that time that the apostles were having a difficult time keeping up with things like taking care of the poor and taking care of the widows. And so one of the things they suggested was to find 7 men who were in the right frame of mind spiritually and understood the church and were willing to go out and help out the apostles, not only in teaching, but also in taking care specifically of widows and the poor. And so they use the term lay hands. And so that idea of laying hands is what's necessary for ordination. So we know, at least in the book of Acts, that deacons were brought about. There weren't women in those 7. However, there were descriptions of women using the word diaconia, which is a word which means servant, in other roles. And so as a servant, there were women in the church that were acting as servants of the church. But the real question becomes, were those women ordained in the sense that we understand ordination today? And so that's the big question. And I know that one of the purposes that women had was to help baptize. And back then, when you were baptized in the nude. I'm glad that doesn't happen anymore. And so in order to help the women who were being baptized, they had women diaconia, deacons, who would help the women get baptized. But other roles that took place for women that were called diaconia were in finances. They would help support the finances of the church. And they would also help out in the house churches that were there at the time. Since slowly but surely Christianity was being pushed out of the synagogues because obviously the Jews were having a hard time with the Christians. They would have Eucharistic meals in homes of usually wealthier people. And in those homes, it was the women that took care of the homes. And so they more or less ran those Eucharistic meals.
And so here in Acts on chapter 6, it's the first time really that we see any kind of establishment of a hierarchy with the deacons, and
that's right,
in an official capacity.
Right, that's exactly right. And it's the first time that we even understand the whole sacrament of ordination. So.
Yeah. Okay. I read something. I don't know if I read it correctly, but it talks about that it was really in the Middle Ages where the role of the deacon changed radically, and then prevented women from fulfilling that, because in the past the deacon was a function of a helper, of an assistant, and then in the Middle Ages the deacon was a stepping stone into priesthood, and since women were not allowed to be priests, then it started excluding women.
That's right. And even before that, interestingly enough, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit here.
Yeah.
Even before that, deacons had far more power than any of the presbyters, any of the priests. And the reason being is because deacons were ordained to support the bishops. Because the bishop had not only ecclesiastical power within the church, but also political power. The deacons who served those bishops were very influential. And not only that, but deacons at that time were also in charge of the finances. And it got to the point where many priests, maybe they were getting a bit jealous about that. And so the power of the deacon was suppressed.
I see.
And it got to the point where the permanent diaconate, in other words, people who were ordained to the diaconate for life, and they didn't move into the priesthood or the bishopric, that went away. It became a point where the diaconate was transitional. So for a priest to be a priest, first he had to be a deacon, and
Right.
The whole permanent deacon went away.
So then we can potentially say, and I don't know if everybody agrees on this, that in the early days of the church to the beginning of the Middle Ages, we saw women in a lot of roles that are similar to the roles of deacons that we have today. But then the political climate changed. The deacon became a stepping stone into the priesthood, the first level, if you will, of ordination.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, then women no longer were able to hold that position.
Yeah, and that probably happened in as early as maybe the 3rd, 4th century.
Now, when did this position of the deacon change back into a permanent position held by a lady? Did that happen during Vatican II?
It did. It was Vatican II that put the permanent diaconate back into action.
Okay.
And it was probably not until the 1980s that we saw, or maybe late 1970s, when we first saw our first permanent deacons post Vatican II.
That's wonderful. And now that has happened, then there's a push by some areas of the church to say we may have some precedence of women, in this position. Talk a little bit about the historical precedence and how that affects decisions that the church makes.
Yeah, the whole idea, one of the things that Vatican II brought out was that we need to look back into our past and see how the church was run early on, to see whether or not we sort of dropped the ball on some things.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we look at the history of the church and try to determine whether or not something is valid, one way that we can determine whether it was valid is to go all the way back to the beginnings of the church, because It's in the beginnings of the church that those people were closest to what Jesus was teaching. What I mean by that in time, okay? And so it was during that time that they would have either done something or not done something within the church because they understood what Jesus wanted them to do.
Okay.
So we have to go all the way back to see if there's precedence. Now, as we move forward in time, a lot of things that were done in the church were done not because there was precedence in the first or second centuries, but because before Rome became centralized in terms of the ecclesiastical power, the power of the church resided in the center in Rome. Bishops themselves had autonomy, quite a bit of autonomy. And so there were bishops throughout Europe and the Near East, Middle East. And when they ran their churches, they would do things that weren't necessarily being done everywhere. They were just doing them because they believed it was the right thing to do. And then when you start to take a poll of these different areas, you would start to see things that were being done, maybe not just at one place, but several places, that was, in the eyes of the church, something that should be spread throughout the church.
Okay.
And so when we start to look at those things start to have influence over whether or not the church should do certain things or not do certain things. Okay.
Yeah, because historical precedence doesn't necessarily just go back to the times of Jesus, because the times of Jesus, it was Jesus and 12 apostles, and that's it. But as the church grew, then things started evolving.
Yeah.
So we have to look into maybe a little bit more, past the first origins of the church, to see how things were done then. Okay.
Especially with the hierarchy and the way the churches were run. When I talk about precedence, what I'm really talking about is, in history, how and why did certain things come about in the church? And that includes things like the ability for women to be part of things like the Mass, to be in charge of certain aspects of the church.
Now, that concept of historical precedence, we see it because, Jesus was male, the apostles were male, and they became, in essence, the priests, the first set of priests,
Technically speaking, bishops.
Bishops, yeah, okay, yeah. But there are some that say that the reason it was male, it's because at the time of Jesus, society were male driven, and that's why Jesus had to be a man, because as a woman, the daughter of God wouldn't have been able to achieve the things that Jesus did. Why is that a fallacy? Why is that mistaken?
Because God can do anything, number one, and he could have sent his only begotten daughter, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay. So why did he send Jesus his only begotten son? Because that's what God did. I mean, who are we to question that? That's how I see it. Now, also, to be clear, the church has always taught that the most influential person in the church, aside from Jesus Christ, has been Mary, the mother of God.
That's true. That is true.
Mary is the mother of God. Who has more influence on this church? Who has more influence than Mary herself, other than Jesus Christ? And so we can't say that women haven't had a preeminent role in the church since the very beginning, because they absolutely have.
No, I agree. I mean, I look at the example of Saint John Paul II, or Saint Mother Teresa, or Maximilian Kolbe, and what did all of those saints have in common is the devotion to Mary, and realizing that Mary provides us the path to the heart of Jesus. So, how can we say that women hold not an important role in Christianity and Catholicism when we have Mary at the center,
exactly.
the way to Jesus?
And there is some theological thought that says that Mary is the conduit through which all grace comes.
Yeah.
It's not infallible, but it's a teaching nonetheless that's been taught for quite some time, that all grace comes through Mary. All the grace of the church comes through Mary. And that's an interesting concept. We don't, as Catholics, have to subscribe to that notion, but it's a notion that's been around for centuries.
Well, and I mean, it starts at the foot of the cross when Jesus told, was it John, man, behold your mother, and basically it was not John, look at her as your mother and take care of her, but it was man as in humanity. So she became the mother of humanity at that moment.
She became the mother of the church.
Of the church, yes.
Which is humanity for all intents and purposes. So yes, in that, we as Catholics believe that she was given that preeminent role, that Mary was in fact the mother of the church.
So she holds a prominent spot in there. Now, if we go back to the argument of women deacons, let's not get to the discussion about priests yet, but women deacon. Right. There has been several studies, if you will, several instances of that being studied by the church as late as Pope Francis, right?
Yeah, so the most recent study that was done was in 2016, and they didn't come to any particular conclusion. Mm-hmm. And so in April of this year, actually I think it was April 6th, Pope Francis wanted to put together another commission to look at this again, which tells me that Pope Francis is very interested in the subject.
Yeah.
Now, whether anything comes of it, we're not sure. And again, the reason for the study is to see the precedents that had been applied to the church with regard to women deacons in the past.
It's interesting because I get, and this is my personal feeling, that he wants it to happen. That's why he's making
I think so.
Another council yet, because if he didn't want it to happen, he would have said, oh, okay, well, it didn't happen with the first gathering and the first study, so that's it. Let's put it to rest. That'll be very interesting to follow that.
Yeah, it will be.
And see what happens in there.
Yeah.
That's great. So now let's talk about women as priests.
Yeah.
And what does the church tell us about women as priests?
Well, there's certainly no precedence for it based on what I understand about it, but I think it's more a theological question than it is anything else. And, I really feel uncomfortable about all this, discussing whether or not women should hold ordained positions in the church. I have my own opinions, but if we look at it, I'm going to say something that I don't want to be misunderstood.
Okay.
So I'm going to say this delicately, but I think a lot of times people equate ordination with power. Now, here's the problem. Here's the problem with this. First of all, granted, all the power in the church comes from ordained or mostly ordained men. I'm not going to deny that. However, ordination is not a ticket for power. The purpose of ordination is to be servants.
Right.
And ordination in and of itself means that you are the servant of whom it is you're to serve, and not somebody who is to be applying any kind of political power over. And so what I'm concerned with here is that when women talk about wanting to be ordained a priest, why are they wanting to be ordained a priest? Is the reason they wanted to be ordained a priest because they feel like they would have more influence over the church's direction? And honestly, I mean, this is from me, I think that men in general do have a lot more influence in the Catholic Church than they probably should. But again, that does not constitute a reason why ordination ought to be handed off to women. So then the next question is, why shouldn't women be ordained? Well, Jesus was a man. And when Jesus chose his apostles, he chose no women. He chose 12 men. And again, we're talking about God here. Jesus is God. He chose 12 men. And so there was a certain precedence that was placed on the church in that regard. And since the beginnings of the church, there has never been a female priest of any kind or bishop. And then when you look at also, biblically speaking, that the church is seen as the bride of Christ. The church is seen as the bride of Christ. Well, the bride is the feminine side of a marital relationship. I want to read something to you. It's from letter of St. Paul to the Ephesians. And this is one of the parts in the letters of St. Paul where women kind of cringe. Mm-hmm. But I want to put it in context with the idea of the church being the bride and Jesus being the groom. Okay? So let me read it and let me talk about it. Okay? It says this: be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. So right off the bat, that first sentence is basically talking about the whole of the church, the people of the church. Be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives should be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of his wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, he himself the Savior of the body. As the church is subordinate to Christ, so wives should be subordinate to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her to sanctify her, cleansing her by the bath of water, baptism, with the word, that he might present to himself the church in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So also husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one hates his own flesh, but rather nourishes and cherishes it, even as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak in reference to Christ and the church. In any case, each one of you should love his wife as himself, and wife should respect her husband. Now, there's two ways that we can take this reading. One way we can take this reading is to look at it purely from a humanistic male-female relationship and marital relationship, okay? Or we can look at this as a paradigm for the church, that Christ is the husband, the church is the wife, and that if we look at this from the perspective that wives should be subordinate to their husbands, that wives is all of us, we in the church, are subordinate to Christ.
The will of Christ.
Right. Okay. All right. I tell you all this because not that the writer of Ephesians, and by the way, it's questionable whether St. Paul actually wrote this. This is one of those letters that was probably not written by Paul. And because it wasn't written by Paul, we don't believe that Paul had these thoughts about women. Okay.
I see. Well, I try to have this reading at my wedding, and Stella said no. But,
and I might understand that. So whoever wrote this had this sense that what I want to do is I want to equate the church to the way marriages are today.
Right.
Okay?
At that time, especially.
At that time, exactly. The purpose for this writing wasn't to subordinate wives. The purpose for this writing was to understand how the church ought to understand Jesus Christ.
I see.
Okay? So if we look at it from that paradigm, if we look at it from the perspective that we as a church are the wife, the spouse, to the husband, Jesus Christ, and that relationship ought to look like something that a marital relationship looked like back then the purpose of this reading isn't to determine that wives should be subordinate to their husbands, but that the church should be subordinate to Jesus Christ.
I see.
All right. Now, given that part of it, we have to say this, that if we were going to keep that paradigm that Jesus was the husband, that the church is the bride, and that a priest acts in persona Christi, then theologically speaking, it doesn't make sense to have a woman priest.
I see. It has nothing to do with capability. It has nothing to do with thought.
No.
Because in reality, women can and do hold, very critical positions of authority and power within the church.
And more so. Not enough yet, I don't think. I don't think enough yet.
Yeah.
But I think more and more so, the church is moving in the right direction. Absolutely.
And there are things that are mysteries, and it's very hard for us mere mortals to understand why. Why did God choose Jesus to be a male, and why did Jesus pick 12 apostles who were males? And it's hard to let go.
It is, and also, again, as I said in our last session, it's really difficult to understand the mind of God.
Yeah.
If we were thinking as God does, maybe we have a perfect understanding of why God chose things the way he chose them.
Right.
But we don't, because we're human.
Right.
But what we can do is subordinate ourselves to that teaching. Right. Because if it was God teaching us that, then this is just Ken speaking, but I think we need to accept that.
No, I'd see where you're coming from, and it just reminds me of the Divine Mercy Chaplet and just saying, Jesus, I trust in you. There's things that I definitely don't understand and will never understand, but I have to trust.
Yeah. One other thing before we move off this. One of the things that the church believes is that men and women have specific roles to play, not only in the life of the church, but also in our physical lives. I think that everybody would agree that the way God made us as human beings, there are certain things that women can do within the family unit that men cannot do. Mm-hmm. And vice versa. There are certain things that men can do that women cannot do within the family household. And what I mean by that is there's a certain role that men play to their children in that paternalistic sense. There's something that men can give their children that women can't, and there's something that women can give to their children that men can't. And nurturing is one of those things, I think, that women offer that men are not all that good at. And so when we look at it from that perspective, if we believe that that's the case, and personally I do, I believe that Ruby, my wife, has a certain nurturing capability that I just don't have.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times she tells me, why did you tell him that? That wasn't very nice, And I think back and I think, probably the way I said it wasn't the right way. You're right. So they have this nurturing effect. Mm-hmm. Women have a nurturing effect. Well, why can't that nurturing effect be brought into the church? And Pope Francis talks about this, by the way.
Right.
That women in their roles need to bring that nurturing effect into the church so that the direction of the church can be more nurturing.
Yes. And that's really definitely a change that Pope Francis is trying to make. He's trying to make the church more nurturing, more caring, more compassionate, Yeah. So I think it's very, very interesting. Ken, I really, there's going to be tons of different opinions in this. I don't think that we have just scratched the surface on this discussion, and we may have not resolved anything,
No.
Other than to say, well, we don't know the mind of God and why God did the way the things
or women did, for that matter.
Or women, But it has been very, very interesting, and it has been very enlightening conversation.
Yeah, I think so. And I hope it's useful. I mean, there are still going to be people out there that may not agree with what we have to say about it, but
Of course.
I try to be honest about what the church teaches and the perspective that the church brings forward. And to be honest, there are certain things that the church needs to look at with regard to the role of women in the church.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks everyone for listening and joining us, and tune in next week. We'll have another interesting topic. Not sure which one's going to be yet, but I'm sure it's going to be controversial, and I'm sure it's going to be interesting.
I love controversy, don't you?
I do too. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Take care.